Hey, what's up? John Sonmez from simpleprogrammer.com. So today I thought I would do a video on my top 10, that's right, top 10 podcasts for programmers. Top 10 podcasts for software developers, whatever you want to call it. But I've got a top 10 and it changes from time to time. I have a post on actually probably I think it's the best post on podcasts for software developers. You can check it out here on Simple Programmer where I list all of them. I try to keep that up to date. By the way, if there's stuff that's missing or you want to see stuff change or added there, go ahead and comment on that, and I'll try to update that. But I keep it updated regularly. But I thought maybe you'd like to know what I consider to be the top 10 right now, at least, podcasts for software developers. And it changes from time to time, and it changes. I don't listen to as many podcasts as I used to, but I thought I would list those out for you and, let me know. Leave a comment below if you disagree, if you've got one that you think should have made the top 10. But this is my personal top 10 right now. So let's start off with number 1 here. So number 1, I would say is, and these aren't really in any particular order, but the number 1 on my list is a podcast called .NET Rocks, which you can check out here. It is one of the oldest podcasts in existence, actually. Carl Franklin and gosh, why am I spacing here? Richard Campbell put this podcast together. Actually, it's changed a little bit, but I think Carl's been there from the beginning. I've been on this show probably like 4 times, maybe 5 times. Really good, daily. I think it's daily or every other day. Basically, they do a few times a week podcast, up to date. It used to be really about .NET. Now it's about more than .NET. It's more programming related in general. Definitely a really good podcast. They have excellent guests on there all the time, and it's a well-produced show and interesting topics. So, it covers a lot of different things. So obviously there's a .NET slant here, more towards Microsoft developers, but just in general, a good podcast and lots of really cool topics. And sometimes they do these special episodes where they'll go in depth into like technical topics or just scientific topics that are pretty cool. They did some on like nuclear technology. They did one on solar power, lots of cool stuff there. So anyway, moving on. Number 2 I have for you is a podcast called Hurting Code. You can check that one out here. And Hurting Code it's not as regular of a podcast, but it's got a few really good technologists that come together and they interview people. They talk about a lot of the latest and greatest technology. It's a really entertaining podcast, a lot of really good viewpoints on there. It's not updated as regularly as I would like. It used to be a little bit more consistent, but it seems to still be alive, so I still definitely recommend that podcast. And it's always been one of the ones that I've enjoyed quite a bit. Next up, number 3, HANSEL Minutes. You can check this one out here by my buddy Scott Hanselman. I've been on this podcast a couple of times. I need to talk to Scott and say, hey, let's do another episode. But anyway, Scott Hanselman, if you don't know him already, he's a technologist. He is quite famous. He actually did the foreword for my book, or did one of the forewords for my book, Soft Skills, Software Developer's Life Manual. If you haven't checked that out, go and check it out. Anyway, he has a lot of interesting topics on his show. He talks about some pretty cool stuff. He usually finds some really interesting people doing really interesting things. So definitely a general, technology and programming podcast. He has a good way of asking questions, of making things simple so that he breaks things down, because a lot of people don't necessarily understand all the in-depth technical terms. So it's a real good podcast that applies to anyone at any level, really, I think. So, all right, next one here, number 4, we've got Developer on Fire. Now this is a fairly new podcast, but I've been on I think I've been on 2 episodes, maybe 1 episode of this one. And this podcast is actually really, really good. I can't believe the level of guests that have shown up on the. You'll be amazed if you look through the guest list and you see everyone that David Rule has gotten on the podcast. It's pretty amazing. He's a great guy. He's dedicated. He produces episodes. I think at one point he was doing it every day, but now it looks like it might be once every couple of days or so. Anyway, this is probably one of the best upcoming podcasts. I think he's already on episode like 172. Really, really good one. I highly recommend it. Definitely subscribe to Developer on Fire. Next, we have Talk Python to Me, and you can check that one out here. And this is a podcast that I wasn't extremely aware of because I'm not really a Python developer, but it has some really good content. I went through, I was actually on an episode a little while ago, and I had a great time, and it has a great community. I got so many different comments from people in the Python community about my appearance on the show, but it's a really good podcast, especially if you're a Python developer, but there's more than Python being talked about in this podcast. If you're a Python developer, absolutely, you need to check that one out, but it's worth listening to even if you're not. Next, let's see, where are we at here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Number 6 here, Code Newbie. This is a great podcast. I love this podcast. I was just on this podcast pretty recently, and the host of this podcast, Saren, I believe that's how you say her name. Sorry if I mispronounced it. But anyway, she is a great interviewer. She's just an awesome interviewer. Amazing the way that I think she used to work for NPR, so that's probably why, but she really gets to the depth of topics and really gets people to come out of their shell and ask, kind of questions that really actually get people to do more than just give the generic answer to things. So really good podcast, really good for beginners, very diverse, very kind of welcoming culture that I participate in their Twitter chat. They really promote the podcast, and they really created this community around the podcast that I haven't seen before. So if you're a new developer, if you're starting out, you really want to subscribe to this podcast, and you want to listen to it, and you want to join the community because it's really, really helpful. Lots of really good resources. It's a fairly new one, but it's doing well, and it's got the strongest community I've seen for a podcast. Next, we have number 7 here, Software Engineering Radio. This is an excellent podcast. I was on an episode of this a while ago. It's a little bit more scientific, a little bit more, I believe that the ACM or IEEE, one of those organizations is responsible for it. So it's a little bit more on the technical, on the sort of academic side of it, but it has really good information. They get really good guests on there of high-level guests, and they talk about topics from a very, like I said, more of an academic level, but some of that rigor is good, right? There's different types, and this is more of the rigor type, and I feel like they have really good topics, and this is where you can really get to learn some things from some experts where they talk in more technical terms than some of the lighter podcasts, but definitely one that I highly recommend. That is the Software Engineering Radio. Next, we've got JavaScript Jabber. What are we on? Like number 7, I believe. Maybe it's 8. I don't know. Let me count this and see if we're going to have 10 or we're going to have more than 10 here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. No, it's 10. So JavaScript Jabber, a buddy of mine who you can find on the Entre Programmers podcast, one of my podcasts. I didn't put on this list because it's not strictly a programming podcast. I don't consider it in the top 10, but it's my podcast. Chuck runs this podcast. He's got quite a few podcasts, but JavaScript Jabber is one of his older properties, and it is still going strong. It's a great JavaScript podcast. Probably what I would consider the best JavaScript podcast. It's a panel format, which is really cool. So there's a lot of really interesting people that are on there that are giving their opinions. I've been on there a couple of times, I believe, and I've talked about soft skills. And I recently did an episode where I was talking about the Chrome tools, how to develop the Chrome extensions, actually. And it's really good, like I said, JavaScript content, but more than just JavaScript content. The panel format is a format that works really well because you get a lot of different perspectives, a lot of interesting questions, and it's a very regular podcast. So you'll get this podcast every week. I definitely recommend that you subscribe to it if you're a JavaScript developer. I mean, if you're any kind of web developer, you're going to be doing JavaScript. So check that one out. Along the same lines, at number 9 is Ruby Rogues. Again, this one is also put out by my buddy Chuck as part of DevChat TV, and this podcast is quite interesting. I think it's one of the older podcasts. It's been around for a long time. It used to be very, very much technical on Ruby. So if you look at the older episodes, you get some really technical content, but then it evolved into a lot more of a soft skills type of general programming. So I think a lot of people that listen to Ruby Rogues are not Ruby developers. It's just because it has really, really good content, good guests on there. I've been on there at least once, I think, talking about soft skills, and it's changed recently. So the panel has been sort of revamped. There was some kind of fallout and stuff. I'm not going to get into the details, but it's going to probably go back to a little bit more on the technical side of it, but really good just development in general. A lot of really good topics, a lot of really good guests. I mean, some really, really famous guests have come on here, including the creator of Ruby. So I think DHH was on there. Definitely check that one out. And then finally, the last one I'll say here is the changelog. You can check that one out. I haven't listened to too many episodes myself. But I had the ones that I have liked. What changelog is, and the reason why I put it on this list is it is basically focused on open source development. So if you're an open source developer, you want to know what's going on in the GitHub community and the open source environment, definitely check that one out. It has really good content. It's very regularly updated. A lot of people love this podcast, and I definitely like it myself from the episodes that I've heard. So anyway, that's my top 10. I'll give you, I already gave you one bonus, which was onto programmers. You notice I didn't put my own podcast on here, but I will plug it now. You can check out Simple Programmer Podcast. You may be listening to it. I mean, I do this on YouTube, but if you're not already listening to it, if you're watching on YouTube, you can check out my podcast here. Again, you can find the list of all of the podcasts, my podcast directory, the ultimate list of developer podcasts here. And I try to keep this updated as much as possible. Podcasts come and go, but you can check that out. Anyway, I hope you found this useful. Podcast is a great way to improve your career, to learn what's going on, to stay up to date. I often listen to podcasts while I'm working out, while I'm running. In my ears, I'll just put on my headphones, or when I'm driving somewhere. And I definitely encourage you to check out a few of these, put them in your podcast player. If you want one, I recommend for iPhone, it's called Overcast. I've been using that one, and that one basically lets you speed up the podcast and cut out the dead space, so it can help you to get through them faster. Anyway, I'm a big podcast listener, obviously, and I hope that you are too, or you will be. So if you like this video, click the subscribe button below, and you can subscribe and get all my videos on all kinds of topics. I do about 2 to 3 videos a day. And if you're already a subscriber, thank you very much. Thumbs up if you like this video. I'll talk to you next time. Take care.